Hello and welcome to Practicalli with me, John Stevenson. Thank you very much for joining. Today we're going to continue looking at the Banking on Clojure project. And this week I've really been thinking about simplifying the design we've come up with so far. I felt the specs were a little bit too verbose, and similarly with the database schema. Probably been going around a bit too much on the design, but it feels much better now to work with. So we'll walk through all the changes I've made, and hopefully it's kind of simplified and makes much more sense. And then I think once we've got through this, then we're ready to add connection pooling and add the some kind of component management system. So we'll have a look at mount and component and integrant, and use those to start up the database and then start up the server, and also populate the database as well. At the moment, when we run the program on CLI, we can't run the tests successfully because we're not populating the database yet. Because that's a task that's been done manually while we're doing development. So we need to add the automatic population of the database when we're using H2. When we're using Postgres, then we'd probably want to make sure we've got a clean database to start with. So we'd drop all the tables and then create new ones, so we know what the state is when we're starting. I do have a bit of a cough, so hopefully you'll excuse me as I cough my way through today. There we go. Oh, where are we? Oh yes. So as usual, Practicalli website, live broadcasts, Clojure together support. Thank you very much for that. That's keeping me going. There's a lot more content coming up in the next couple of weeks, especially around Clojure CLI, which I've been doing in the Practicalli Clojure book. And there's loads to add to the Clojure web apps book. Contact me via Clojure Slack, either on Practicalli or as direct message, and then support me via YouTube or other means as you so wish. Go to get a Practicalli banking on Clojure web app. There we go. I haven't pushed the code yet. I'll do that this morning, or possibly even during the test. I've noticed that this is not updating. So CLI has actually failed, I think. If I go to the app, at the moment it's lots of reds. New. And I think this is down to the database and just not being there. So you can't run the tests against the database because they're not there yet. So you can't insert into account holders because it's not there. Because when we run this on CLI, I haven't created the database, so that's something to fix, and that should hopefully then make my tests run on another environment, because it's no good just having it running on my machine. That doesn't help the world. Okay, let's look at what I've changed, because I've changed quite a bit. So this is the source directory for Banking on Clojure, and so we've got source Practicalli. I created a data folder to put things in, to put all the database access stuff in, and I split it up into different places. So we started off with database access, and this has become huge. So it's it's quite a lot of code to navigate. So I tried to break things up, and it also makes it easier to just include certain parts of this code in other namespaces as well. We don't have to include it all So I've broken this database access up, which I'm going to delete this file, or just keep it as a journal. And we've got the connection, which is our basically our database specifications. So we're just including next JDBC here, and we've got a specification for development, staging, and production. And for development environment, I'm just using H2 and specifying the database. And in Postgres, then we're getting the data source from this environment variable. So at the moment, I've got two different environment variables, one for staging and one for live, one for production. And I just set these on the, you can set these on the command line. I've set these in actually in Emacs as well. And I can evaluate these, and and it gives me the spec. It could be on with passwords and everything. So if you've got a keen eye, you can you can copy all my passwords, which I'm going to change because you can update those, and I'll add some details on how to update the connection string to get a new password and username for that. So this is all self-contained, and eventually we'll put in Aero, which is a nice library from Juxt, which helps you manage configuration there. So we don't need to have like a separate database staging and database URL. We can just have a JDBC database URL and then use Aero to switch between that depending on which environment we're using. But that keeps that nice and simple. And I've also included, oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. There we go. I've also included some details on how to actually create that in the code as well as a comment. That makes it easier for people to see how to do it, how to replicate this in case they don't have a database, because this is something we need to create locally. It's something that's going to be available on Heroku by default. So when you're pushing to Heroku, then it's just going to work. But if we want to do this locally, then we do need to add these JDBC environment variables. And we just run this, basically run this command line, and that will generate the JDBC database URL string for us that works with the next JDBC database schema map. And then there is, so I think, is this working? Yes, I've got REPL running. So I can evaluate this with the REPL running, and I've just got this, I've just got these specs there, and in a rich comment block, I'm just providing a way to test, that these schemas work. So in the REPL, you can run information tables and just make sure that you're actually getting a connection to those databases. So it just helps with debugging of the application and also understanding more about the application as well. I'm using CLJ Condo, so I've added the this CLJ Condo ignore, especially where I'm going to redefine vars. So if I've got functions I'm going to create different versions of, then it just tells me that I haven't, it warns me if I've got duplicate function names or other var names. So this just disables that specifically in the comment block. I'm not using it here, but I do use it other places in the design journals. I'm going to start using this. But in the rich comment block, I can evaluate the function, and then I can go and check that I can talk to the staging database. And it's also a quick sanity check that it's actually responsive as well. So if some queries elsewhere are not working, you can always come back here and say, oh yeah, well, I'm connecting to the database, so at least I know that that bit is working. And same for dev, and hopefully, yeah, there we go, and development and production. So this just makes the project easier for somebody else to use, and for me to use when I come back after a few days or a few weeks and I haven't used this. So that's the connections, and I've got the specifications in there, but I'm also going to add the connection pool in here as well, so it's all relatively self-contained, I think. And so I just need to decide which connection pool to use. There's a Hikari and C3PO, but there's also, I think, H2 has a connection pool and also does Postgres as well, so could also use the database connection pools themselves. And then the schema. So I've changed the database design a bit. One of the problems I had, you can find it in the database access, was I had this I had this kind of artificial distinction between account holders and customers. So I was passing in customer details, which was basically those kind of first name, last name, email address, and so on. I had that defined as a spec as a customer. Customer details, but I was not using the only real difference between customer details and account holder was this ID, which did make it more complex to kind of do the specifications. So I ended up having specifications. Oops, where are we? There we go. So I had customer details and I had account holder spec. And it took me a while to think about this, but I actually eventually realized that these things are basically the same thing with just the account holder ID different. So why not call them the same thing? So rather than account holder, have customer unregistered and customer registered. And then I can actually get really specific about the specifications and just kind of give them very specific namespaces here. So instead of just doing the auto resolve, do customer ID and legal name, email address, residential address, and so on. So I've just changed first name, last name just to legal name, just to make it simpler. And to make it more user-friendly, I'm also including a preferred name, so you can actually specify what name you would like the bank to call you. So it makes it a bit more personal feeling. And also your preferred name might not be your legal name as well, so it supports people in that situation. And so then our specification is we've got customer unregistered and customer registered, and I missed a bit off there. Oh no, that's right. No, I have missed it off. Yeah, so then we can put in customer ID into here. Boop. And that just makes it all much simpler to reason about. I don't have to think about customers and account holders. It's just a customer, and a customer will have accounts associated with them as we go. I hope that makes more sense. I think it's a bit more explicit than than here. These I think these are a little bit harder to kind of, for me, I found these more challenging to kind of grasp in my head. Yes, it's customer details, first name, last name, but they're all picking up the namespace from here. So whatever namespace you give up here, it's you could do specs, but then you have all your specs in one place, which you could do. So, but then everything would be spec first name, spec last name, which doesn't really add to the context of what these things are. So I quite like the specifications that are more explicit. Oh, excuse me. Ew, I am starting to get cold again. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we've got more explicit names for qualifications for each of our spec names. Then again, I've got rich comment block that will let me generate specs. So I'm generating a customer unregistered, and it's more specific that way, I think, because customer details is quite general, whereas customer unregistered is a very specific set of data, as is customer registered as well, and so I think they're just more useful and easier to work with when they're named like that. And then we can generate a customer UUID, so we can use that to check to see what's coming back from our inserts and updates and so on, and we can check the values that are coming back. We can generate a specification for that particular value and compare it against the value that's coming back. So we'll cover that in a few minutes. Oh yeah, well here, so here's an example here. So we've got when we do I mean this should work. If you've got it should work. If you've got a custom generator, you might want to do a check, but here we're going to generate customer ID and we're checking it's true. When we get a customer ID, when we get a response back from Next JDBC, we actually get a form like this. So it's actually the same form. We're actually getting customer /ID. So we've got some context for the result. But when we evaluate that, that's almost like a spec, because we're evaluating the fact that we're comparing the ID, which is a UUID value, you're comparing that against the actual map. So it's not the same. It's a map that contains the value that we want, but it's not the value that we want that we're actually checking. Yeah. So, but if we wrap this, boop, Slippy. And we just pull out the ID from the map. Why didn't that work? Yeah, because I took this off. That's what I was doing, yes. Oops. A little bit late net hacking. Is that not working? I've got that working somewhere else. I'll come back to that. And then, oh yeah. Actual schema itself I've changed. So I wanted to make sure that the spec and the schema lines up. And so if you've already got one of these created, so like if you've already got this the schema created, there are tools to generate. There's Clojure libraries to generate the specs from the schema, which would cut down some of the work. But I've kind of rejiggled the schema a little bit. I've simplified the customer names, the table names. So we've got customer and account and transaction. Those are 3 tables. And then, so the customer has an ID. So this is a registered customer because we're only passing in customer details. Like unregistered customers, we're passing in that into the database. So there isn't actually a sense of an unregistered customer in the database. There's only a registered customer in the database. There won't be any. Not sure if there's any value in adding an unregistered customer to the database. So we've got ID, and we're generating this random UUID. So that generates the missing value for us because we're passing in from the UI form that we're going to have in our website and from the spec. We're just passing in these values, most of which are not null, so there have to be values for everything but the preferred name. And I've simplified all the names as well. I just think it makes it easier because you've got customer ID, customer legal name, customer email address, etc., etc., and then get customer ID. So it makes it a bit simpler to think about and also talk about to other developers when you're working together. And then we've got, and I've also added these if not exists as well. So that way, if we try and create the table and it already exists, then if we didn't have this if not exists in this in the SQL statement, then we get an error. We get an SQL error. So rather than having that, we have this. We get a result back from next JDBC saying, okay, well, I didn't create the database. It actually just returns like a 0 instead of a 1. And this is just using identity, which will generate a sequential number for the account number. So we can just use the database to generate the next account number, like unique account numbers for us, and that makes it nice and simple. And I think, yeah, and then just change the names to simplify all these. And the same thing with transactions as well. I just made it ID, date, and I've put in account from and account to. So we've got, we might want to know which account it's coming from, if there's account details in there. I might make that optional for now, I think. But we definitely need to know where it's going to. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to update the account. And then we could have some details about where it's coming from. Maybe if it's a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands, maybe we don't have kind of an account detail. And then we have a reference, so like usually like a piece of text that describes what the reason or the information behind the transaction. And then along with the schema, I've got the functions to create the tables and show the schema and drop the table. And I think these are pretty much the same. We're still just opening specific connections each time. So I will update these once we get the connection pool. I'll update these to include using the connection pool instead. But they're fairly static. The only thing I think I've changed is the drop tables. Yes. So in here, just like with the schemas, we try and drop the table and it's not there. Then we get an error from next JDBC. We get an SQL error. It's really from the database. And so we can't drop a table if it doesn't exist. So we're adding these if exists to the SQL that we're passing. And all we're doing is just passing in the table name to drop And so that keeps the schemas with the functions that directly work with those schemas. And I've got, again, another rich comment block. If we want to test the manually creating the schemas and dropping them and creating tables, ooh, excuse me. Yeah. So if we want to use these functions, then they're all using a database specification. So they've all got database specification as an argument. Ooh, sorry. Oh dear, I'm having a bad morning this morning. I hope everybody else is feeling a lot better than I am today. Yes, so where were we? Yeah, so each of these three functions takes in a database spec. And rather than add this to directly to the namespace, then I'm not adding it directly there, because I'm only going to use that from a different namespace. So the different namespace would have those connection details. So to keep this simpler, I'm just including, where is it? There we go. If we want to use this namespace in the REPL, then you can just evaluate the buffer itself. So I'm just evaluating the whole buffer there. So that evaluates everything that's not in the comment blocks. And so if we want to call create tables, we need to pass in these schema customer, schema accounts with this DB spec, or with staging or production spec. And to do that, we can just include that with this require. So if we evaluate the require, then these are going to work. And then we can go off and show the spec. Yeah, and again, these provide kind of tools inside the code to actually go off and be able to look at the code, use the code in the REPL very easily without having to read through all the details of the code. We can just see here, this is using the API of this namespace, the functions that we want to call, and giving you examples of how you would actually call them. And so you can just go and use those to go and check that everything is working. Then I can drop the tables, recreate them again, and show them. So this sets up a nice little REPL-driven database. You can kind of drop the tables, create some new designs, test them out, run some updates and inserts and CRUDs, and then realize you didn't want to, you got the database schema wrong, and then you can go off and drop those tables, refactor the schema, and then add the schema as well. And you don't need any database tools to be able to do this. You can just do it all inside the REPL. And when you're evolving the schema and the specs at the same time, then that's really useful. You don't have to, you can stay inside your editor that's connected to your REPL and just evolve both spec and schema at the same time. Ooh. Hopefully this is all making sense. Nobody's asking any questions, so it must be nice and simple. And then I've added the same thing. I've added separate comment blocks for staging and production, just to make it really easy to use the code. It's like there's very minimal thought you need to be able to go and actually understand how to use this particular section of the code. And it's still nice and clean because all the details, if you want to change it, is all in the top of the code body with how you use it below. So we've looked at the connection, look at the schema, we looked at the specs. Yes, we did. We covered the specs. Yep. So the specs are a lot simpler. They actually fit on one page now as well, so it's a lot easier to see them. And then we've just got actually doing the CRUD, the create, read, update, and delete functions. So we're requiring Next.jdbc and Next.jdbc SQL. So this is for the friendly functions. So this is the Next.jdbc specific insert and update functions. So for the when we're doing the schema, we're just using the execute, the kind of generic execute this piece of SQL, which we're generating with a string here. And with Practicalli data access, so it's kind of the same name here. I've just kind of broke it up into a separate namespace. Then we've got JDBC SQL insert, and then we can pass in the various pieces of data, and the record data is our hash map of, in this case, customer details we want to put in. So customer unregistered details, and then we can, oops, I'll change that. Here we go. And so we can very easily update the databases there. So I haven't changed those. I just put them in their own namespace. So we got all the create, read, update, and delete. Put those all together. And we've included the way to instrument kind of Next.jdbc specifications. So if I wanted to test these with instrumentation spec, instrumentation enabled. So all the Next.jdbc functions have specifications, and if I want to make sure I'm passing the right data, I can evaluate that spec namespace from Next.jdbc. And I'll go off and instrument, and this basically adds instrumentation to all of the Next.jdbc functions. So like things like get connection and component and connection pool and so on. And so this to make sure that I'll be using those correctly. So when I'm testing out these functions I've written in the, I test them out in the REPL and make sure that I'm passing the right information. This is quite useful because these actually work with data I was passing. So in the create record, I was doing an insert, and for the table name I was passing in a string. But if you do that, then that doesn't meet the specification around insert. It's looking for a keyword rather than a string. Although it did actually work, and then the inserts were working with a string, but you're supposed to pass in a keyword for the table name. So putting on the instrumentation helped me conform to the spec of that. And I suspect maybe at some point the insert is supposed to only work with a keyword for the table name. So it's quite nice little handy safety net, and you can easily turn it off and on So I can just instrument to switch it on and instrument to switch it off again. And I can do that in the namespace that I'm most likely to be using these functions directly. So again, keeping everything together and just making the code more usable. And I think, yeah, so that's it for the database changes. And so when I was doing these read records, then there's a lot of kind of information we need to pass in, like the connection, the table, record data, and whether we're going to return a qualified or unqualified result. I don't really want to include those in the requests I'm making. I don't want to have to inject all that information into a request map, because it kind of pollutes what the request is there for. So I wanted to include those into some kind of, either some handler functions is one way to do it. We could also write some middleware around the requests. But when you're doing that, then it's also, you still kind of have to figure out how to add something. So you'd need to add those details somewhere in the code. And so I started creating kind of wrappers around these functions with specific kind of more business logic functions around these more generic. So these are kind of deleting a record, but it could be a record from any database, so any database table. So to put a layer around that, I was creating some kind of simple wrapper functions around that. I wasn't quite sure about that, but then I realized that they'd be really helpful as helpers for my request handlers. So my request handler code is still quite, oops, that's the wrong one. Request handler code is still quite busy because it's got lots of HTML in. But then if I also have to then include all of the things to create a new customer, so I have to include the database specific things here, then that makes the call, that just makes this bit more complex. I need to kind of manage those details there. So what I decided to do is create this Practicalli handler helpers namespace, which is here, to take out some of the complexity from the request handlers. And I've got these very simple functions here called new customer, new account, new transaction. So these are specific usage of create record. And I can pull in the connection from here, and I'm just pulling in the from the data access, I'm just pulling in the specific create record, update record, like the CRUD functions. And it's very easy for me to go off and create a record because I've got the connection specification I want. Again, I can make this more generic. I make this more environment specific, so that if we can put in like an error configuration in here, so we'll just use whatever is the environment, the database specification that's relevant to the environment. Then I don't need to explicitly include dev. I can just include db spec with a prefix of which environment I'm using. And then I'm passing in the table name as a key, and then the customer details is the hash map of customer details that is the same as the customer unregistered specification. And so then these become very simple ways. I don't need to include all this in my request handlers. I can just basically call this with a new customer, and I'm passing in a kind of a customer specification here. although obviously this would come from a form on the web page. And again, I can create the form in the UI, in a UI namespace. And so you would basically have a call to new customer with the form details that we get from the page. And that would make it this a lot simpler to work with. And then I can create lots of nice request handlers to do lots of wonderful things. But for now, I'm calling helper new customer, and with the data, with the customer data that we'd get from the form, and that's go off and create that new customer in that. And obviously it's hard coded, so this is Terry-able code or terrible code. So don't do this at home as a finished product. This does need to be pulled in from a form that we'll add to the web page. And I think that is as far as we've got. There's one more thing I want to show in the testing, but in terms of what we've got here, so we've got the handlers, and yeah, I don't think there's anything else added here. Yeah, so there's going to be lots of kind of helper functions here that just do very specific things. And it just makes it easier to write the request handlers. And then in the handler helpers test, which we've added, including obviously Clojure test is the testing framework we've been using, and we're just referring in the testing functions. Included spec and spec gen to generate the specs, as well as the Practicalli data specs. And then we're testing the handler helper functions. The functions from the handler helper namespace. And we've just got that software under test. Excuse me a second. And so what we can do is we can actually check to see whether the data we're getting back from the database. So when we do an insert into the database, it gives us back a qualified hash map, and we can check to see inside there that the value we're getting back is a customer ID. So we can check that the database is creating values for the customer ID that are satisfying the customer ID spec. So it's a nice safety check, because we are jumping between the Clojure world and the SQL world, so it's very useful to have checks around those. It's a very obvious boundary that you definitely want to have checks around. And so we can use spec. You can also use prismatic schema, which is very popular before spec came out. But you definitely want some check between all the boundaries you've got there as well. As here, we're also adding unit tests as a check around the boundaries around the helper handler functions. We'd have unit tests around there to make sure that they're all working correctly as well. And so this is checking that when we create a new customer, and rather than hard code in the data that I did in the handler itself, so rather than doing the rather than hard coding this form of data, I've just used a spec to generate that instead. So I'm getting spec gen to generate this handler to the customer unregistered specification. So that's going to generate me a single instance. So if I just evaluate that piece of code here, then it's generating, oh no, wrong one, oops. That's the reference it generates. So it's generating a reference here to the specification I've got. What we want to see is that one, the spec generate. So it's generating a customer, preferred name, residential address, legal name, and so on, and generating some random data. So whenever I run this, is actually populating the database with some new tests. So I do need to do a setup here that will add in so we do need to do a setup that will add in creating the database tables if they're not there already. So to do. And we can also use that information. There's probably better ways to do this here, but we can register. Oh, that's not right anymore, is it? No, that's what it used to be called. New customer. Oh yeah, and it's not customer details anymore, is it? No. What do I call it? Oh, I don't know what I call it now. What did I call it from the helper handlers? So we've got read. So we got, we just got account details. Our customer account overview. Yeah, okay, we'll call it that. I might change that name. Boom. So we can generate a new customer using this piece of code, and then we can go off and actually get the whole details from there, because by default, when we're just using insert, it's only going to return any of the values that are automatically generated. So it's only returning the new customer ID, but we can pull that out and we can get the ID, and we can give that to customer account overview, and that runs the SQL to go off and get the. Let's make this a bit easier to read. It goes off and just does an SQL statement, select star, where the ID is the customer ID that we're passing in. And then we can go off and update the database and get the results back if it's all working. Did that work? I'm not sure if that worked. Something's broken. Where are we? Oh, that's old one on. So I'm going to add more unit tests in here. At the moment, I think they're all passing. Oh, they're not passing. Something's broken with that. That was working last night. Oh, we're not getting. Oh, did I kill all the database? What I did. Yes, I think I killed all the database, so that might be why it's not working. Let me check. So if we go back to schema, create the tables. The tables there, customers there, accounts there, transactions there, and then let's just check this is working. Oh. Oh, did I include the wrong? Oh, that's new customer. Okay, oops, yes. New customer. Okay, so we get a new customer and that's still not working. That's strange. I'll have to fix that. But basically, I'm going to have a look through Next.jdbc again and see what the kind of best ways are to, because I want to be able to create a new customer and then basically go and present the web page of the new customer so we can see all the details of that on the web page. Oops. Let's just see. I've missed something. Oh, I've missed something off because it's not returning. Oh, that's interesting. Is it working? Not quite sure what I've done here. Oh, that's returning everything but the... Oh, that's the customer generate. That's what we're generating. Okay, I see. So I'm getting back customer ID. Oh, is it because I've got that? That's yes. Nope. Let me check. A bit of live coding here. So this is select where customer ID. We're passing in the customer ID. That should work. Let me just check. So we can check that we're actually getting an ID back. So this should evaluate everything but the customer account. Oh, why are we not getting an ID back from there? Very strange. Oh, customer ID. There we go. That's what it was. Yes, because it's got a keyword, so I was using the wrong keyword there. Qualification of the keyword. There we go. That should work now. There we go. Yay! Saturday morning programming. I can do it. There we go. I'm sure there must be a better way to do this in Next.jdbc, but you can see I can also chain the functions together. So the result of one I can use to generate requests from another, so I can then populate the database, so populate the web page with the relevant information that we've just added. And so when we've clicked register like a new customer, then we get a page with this information printed nicely, except we probably won't include the customer ID. And then yeah, and then we can now start working on the request handlers and making them simpler by taking out all the UUID code, taking out all the UI code. Alrighty, so quite a few changes there. Hopefully that makes that a lot simpler. If you've got any comments, if you've got any better designs around this, then please let me know. I'm not claiming to be an expert in using spec, and certainly not an expert in database design, but this is nice. It seems like a nice, clean, simple design that is working so far. Yeah, anything else we've added? No. And so we can get working on. So we can kind of move. I think we can come to a point where we can start moving on building the rest of the application, because we got a little bit involved in getting the right design for the database, but I think that's quite important to get the right design and schema figured out, because then it just makes everything else a lot easier. You don't have to refactor everything once you've like halfway through building something. So it's quite important to get that right, because it is underpinning everything else that we kind of do as well. Anything else we adding? No. Nope. So that's about it for that. Just one additional point. I'm going to do some work on, or been doing work on the Clojure CLI tools as a new release. Just come out, I think just yesterday actually. So if you go, has the website been updated? If you go to clojure.org, then in the getting started, have they updated the release yet? Oh yes, they have yet. So release 697, very memorable number there. That's got some new changes in there. There's some things that are deprecated as well, so it is worth having a look at kind of the new stuff. And I'm going to do some videos around that very soon in the next week. And if you go to GitHub, Practicalli, Clojure deps.edn. So in here I'm going to push, I can now push my qualified aliases, keywords and new flags, and push that to live. And this has got a lot of changes in the deps.edn file as well. Let's make that bigger. Ooh, make that bigger. So I've qualified all the aliases to make them easier to understand what their purpose is. So again, this is not a project configuration. This is like a configuration for aliases for all your projects. So I made them more explicit names to make sure they're available in all projects. They're not easily overwritten in a local project. And so you've got using Rebel readline as a REPL or Rebel. And then we've got things like env-dev that sets up environments. So things like dev, if you want extra deps to be able to find dependencies for you, so you can just use this library to just find a specific library based on a keyword that you give, a search term that you give. And then we got CLJ new. So we've got projects. I've grouped all these under projects. So you've got new project. You can add things to projects. You can do a project check. You can do project find deps. I seem to have that twice now. And then project outdated. So it just gives a nice qualification to these aliases. And most of the time, I think it's nice how you can have like a little script. If you don't want to type these in, you can just have a little script to do these as well. Or if you really wanted to, you can just copy the copy the alias into your project deps.edn file and just call it whatever you want to. Yep. And then they've got things like libs and source. But I'll do a more detailed set of videos around this and show you how to use them as well. With the we also got this instead of using a flag, so instead of doing Clojure and using a to add aliases, we got the m flag, which basically replaces a, and this is for Clojure main, which is essentially what a lot of the aliases were doing, was calling a Clojure main and running some kind of library tool. In this case, we're running CLJ new, and this is just generating a luminous template. But now we've got the option with some projects where they take in a hash map. We can give it specific, we can basically qualify the names that we're using on the command line and give them some context. So when we want to create a new project, we can use template app and name Practicalli application, and that is more readable for somebody to come along and say, well, this is how we've created the project, or this is how you create projects. You specify a template, where there's no indication here that Luminous is a template. So it's if you're not using Clojure every day, or if you've just started using Clojure, then this approach is kind of easier to understand what you're doing and which bits are being passed in, because they're all kind of distinct, and these pluses are values that we're passing into the Luminous template. So I think from a usable point of view, then this approach is nicer, but I'm still including main ops as well, so you can still use the M option if you're more familiar with that as well. And not all libraries are going to support this just yet out of the box. So the nice thing with using exec function and exec args is you can specify some templates, some default values for just calling project new. So by default, you can do I can just do Clojure new, and it will create a library called Playground. Or I can call project new and specify the name, and it'll create a library with that name. And so as people get more into it, you can kind of do some nice setups and some nice aliases that cut down how much you have to remember in your command line commands. Alrighty, well, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Apologies for coughing so much. Hopefully I'll be better in the next few days, and we'll see you next time. Again, don't forget to go off, and all the content is on the Practicalli website as usual, and I'll be doing a lot of updates in the Practicalli Clojure book. I'll be moving everything over to the new release, and which should kind of mostly work. Shouldn't be any too much changes in there, just changing lots of A's to M's. But I'll be updating this using Clojure tools section, and updating this, make sure that kind of these things are all updated, updating the aliases I'm using, and I have to update that screenshot. Cool. And also change the theme. I'm going to apply this theme to all the other books as well. So if you've got any comments on the theme I'm using, then please let me know. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to the whole hour, if you made it this far. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.